My name is Hannah Cole. I'm 28 years old, and the night my life split in two, I woke up to the sound of a heart monitor screaming in the dark and the taste of blood and plastic in my throat. The room around me was a blur of white light and shadow, my left arm wrapped in thick bandages, my body aching like I'd been thrown from a moving car. A nurse leaned over me, her face kind and tired, and said I'd been unconscious for nearly 2 days. Then almost gently, she told me that my father had already signed some papers and left the hospital. He walked out before I ever opened my eyes, as if I were a bill he couldn't pay, instead of the only family he had. Lying there under those harsh fluorescent lights, I thought the worst pain I would face was realizing I'd been abandoned when I needed him most, but I was wrong. That hospital bed was only the starting line of a truth that would tear apart everything I believed about who I was and where I came from. Before I go any further, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and if you've ever had to stand on your own when family let you down. Hit that like and subscribe button so we can walk through this together. I grew up in small rentals and secondhand furniture, the kind of houses where the windows stuck in the winter, and you learn to sleep through the sound of the furnace kicking on and off. Gary. Back then, I called him Dad without thinking about it. Worked odd jobs and night shifts, always coming home smelling like oil cigarettes or something sharp and chemical I couldn't name. His partner, Linda, was the only softness in that house. She made boxed macaroni feel like a feast and taught me how to fold laundry, just so saying it was important to take care of what little we had. When she died from a lung infection the year I turned 13, the house went quiet in a way that never really changed. After that, Gary didn't hug me much. He talked in short sentences, mostly about bills and chores, and he liked to remind me that nothing in life was free. Still, he kept a roof over our heads, and I worked hard not to give him a reason to be angry. From the time I was 16, I held whatever job anyone would give me, stocking shelves at the grocery store, babysitting for neighbors, cleaning offices after closing. By 28, I was pulling double shifts as a waitress at a 24-hour diner off the highway in Riverton, Illinois, my feet aching most nights before I even made it to my car. The regulars knew me by name, truckers and night nurses, and kids who should have been in bed, and they'd sometimes slip me extra tips for college someday, even though I'd quietly given up on college years before. My world was coupons, cracked vinyl booths, and counting every dollar twice before paying rent. On the local news, I'd see stories about men like William Lawson, the kind of corporate titan whose name was on half the office buildings in the state. Lawson Industries was another universe to me: glass towers, private jets, charity galas. I'd watch those segments from the diner TV while wiping down the counter, thinking some people lived on a different planet altogether. The values that made sense in my life were simple ones. You showed up on time. You did your work. You didn't ask for more than you were given. When you could, you helped people who had even less. Linda had always told me to say please and thank you to leave things cleaner than I found them, and to never forget that kindness didn't cost a dime. I tried to live by that even when Gary's temper ran short or his words cut deeper than he realized. If he snapped that I was too sensitive, I swallowed it. If he reminded me that I owed him everything, I believed it. We didn't talk about feelings in that house, and we definitely didn't talk about dreams beyond keeping the lights on and the car running. Looking back, there were cracks I chose not to see. We never had family photos on the walls, just calendars from auto shops and faded landscapes that came with the frames. Gary dodged questions about my birth. No baby stories, no funny toddler memories, just a muttered, "You were a fussy one," and a quick change of subject. I didn't have grandparents who sent cards or cousins to visit in the summer. If I pushed too hard about why we never saw anyone who shared our last name, his jaw would tighten, and he'd tell me some people were better off left behind. So I learned not to ask. Instead, I poured coffee for strangers, worked holidays, and told myself that if I just kept my head down and saved enough, I could build something of my own someday. The night of the accident started like any other bad weather shift. Freezing rain had been coming down in sheets since evening, coating the parking lot in a slick shine that made me tighten my scarf and walk carefully to my old sedan. I'd stayed late to help cover a coworker's tables, so by the time I slid behind the wheel, my eyes burned and the clock on the dashboard was creeping toward midnight. The wipers squeaked across the windshield, fighting the ice, and the radio crackled in and out between stations as I eased onto the two-lane road that wound toward my apartment. Streetlights glowed in soft halos through the rain, and I remember thinking that I just needed 10 more minutes of focus before I could crawl into bed and start it all again in the morning. I hit the black ice on a curve I'd driven 100 times before. One moment the tires hummed along the wet pavement, and the next the car felt weightless, the back end sliding out as if invisible hands had grabbed the bumper and yanked it sideways. The steering wheel spun under my palms. Headlights from an oncoming car flared in my vision, and metal screamed as my sedan skidded across the lane and slammed into the guardrail. The airbag exploded in my face, white and burning, and for a heartbeat, everything went silent except for the wild pounding in my chest. Glass glittered in the beam of someone's flashlight as a voice shouted from far away, telling me not to move, telling me help was on the way. Then the world narrowed down to sirens' cold air and the feeling of being lifted weightless and helpless onto a stretcher. When I woke in the ICU, my throat raw from a breathing tube, I didn't remember a doctor explained in a calm, practiced voice that my left arm was broken in several places and I'd need surgery if I ever wanted to use it properly again. He mentioned insurance consent forms, follow-up care, a string of words that all translated into one thing in my mind: money. More money than a waitress with an aging car and a thin savings account could dream of paying. Still groggy, I asked for my phone. There was only one person I could think to call, the same man who'd signed my school papers and tax forms and whose name was on my driver's license, Gary. My fingers shook as I found his number, and I pressed the phone to my ear, listening to it ring and ring before he finally picked up. "Dad," I whispered, my voice rough and small. "It's me. I was in a car accident. I'm in the ICU. They're talking about surgery, and I don't know what to do." There was a pause on the line, just long enough for hope to flicker. Then his answer came flat and edged with something I couldn't quite name. "We can't do anything for you, Hannah. No questions. No, are you okay? No, I'm on my way." Just that, and then the sharp click of the call ending, leaving me staring at my own reflection in the dark screen. A little later, I heard two nurses murmuring outside my door about how he'd already been there once, how he'd signed what he needed to sign, and walked out before I woke. As the machines beeped steadily at my side, I pressed my forehead into the stiff hospital pillow and tried to breathe past the ache in my chest. Lying in that bed with rain tapping softly against the window and the smell of antiseptic filling my lungs, I told myself that maybe he was scared. Maybe he didn't understand how bad it was. But beneath those excuses, another thought settled in, heavy and cold. If I made it out of that room, I was going to find out why the man who raised me could look at me, hear my voice shaking on the phone, and feel nothing at all. At the time, I thought I was searching for a reason he didn't want me. I had no idea that within days I would learn a far more unsettling truth, that he had never really been my father in the first place. The first morning after waking in the ICU felt heavier than anything I had expected. The hallway outside my room hummed with activity carts rolling past and nurses calling to one another, but inside those four walls, everything felt unusually still. Sunlight pushed through the blinds in thin stripes, catching on the metal rails of the bed and the IV stand beside me. My arm throbbed beneath the cast, a slow, deep ache that stretched into my shoulder whenever I shifted. I reached for my phone again, trying to ignore the sting of disappointment from the night before, and dialed Gary's number. It went straight to voicemail. I tried a second time, hoping I had misheard something in the static, or that maybe he had stepped away from his phone. The same automated recording answered me quiet and indifferent. I set the phone on my lap and stared at the blank screen until the nurse came in to check my vitals. Carla spoke to me with a soft steadiness that made the room feel a little less empty, asking whether I had eaten and if the pain medicine was helping. I nodded along, grateful for the distraction. As she adjusted the IV line, two other nurses paused outside my door. Their voices were low, but the hallway carried their words into the room anyway. "No emergency contact, signed release, we can't reach him." I lay still, hoping they would move on before realizing how much I could hear. Carla glanced at me with a faint crease in her brow, then changed the subject to something simple, like the breakfast options downstairs, as if she sensed I needed to focus on anything else. A few hours later, a man in a blue uniform stepped inside and introduced himself as Officer Ben Miller. He explained that he was there to collect a routine statement about the accident for the police report. I answered his questions as clearly as I could, describing the rain, the curve in the road, the sudden loss of control. When he asked whether I had family nearby who could help with insurance information or post-operative decisions, I forced out the same answer I had given all my life. Just my father, I said, and when he followed up by asking whether Gary had been in touch, the words caught in my throat. Not since I woke up. Officer Miller hesitated, his pen hovering above the page, before giving a small nod and closing his notebook. He didn't press for more, but his silence lingered after he left, settling over the room like an additional weight. Lunch sat untouched on my tray that afternoon. The soup cooled quickly, leaving a thin film on top, and I moved the spoon around without much intention. Carla returned to change the dressing on my arm, and after she checked the monitors, she sat near the foot of my bed for a moment. "You have anyone coming by today?" she asked in a gentle tone, as if she already knew the answer. When I shook my head, she didn't offer any platitudes or forced optimism. Instead, she said quietly, "People sometimes carry secrets their whole lives, even from the ones they love." I looked toward the window, watching the rain smear the view of the parking lot, unsure how to respond. She didn't explain what she meant, and I didn't ask. When she left the room, felt too quiet again. I drifted in and out of sleep as the afternoon stretched on the beeping of the machines, becoming part of the rhythm of my thoughts. Every time I opened my eyes, the same questions surfaced. Why hadn't Gary returned? Why had he walked out so quickly? The nurses came and went, adjusting lines and writing notes, but none of them mentioned him. I tried calling again later, hoping this time it might ring through, but the call failed before it even connected. My phone screen flashed a brief warning about a weak signal, though I knew that wasn't the real issue. I set it aside and pulled the blanket higher across my chest, trying to ignore the hollow feeling spreading through me. The next morning came early, the hallway lights brightening before the sky outside had fully shifted from gray to blue. I was half awake, my thoughts drifting, when the door opened again. I expected another nurse or maybe a doctor making rounds. Instead, 2 men stepped inside wearing dark jackets and carrying leather-bound folders. Their badges caught the light as they introduced themselves. Miss Cole, the older one, asked, his tone steady but not unfriendly. I straightened a little in the bed, pulling the blanket around my waist, and nodded. He exchanged a brief look with his partner before stepping closer to my bedside. "We're with the Rockford Police Department," he said, resting the folder against his hip. "There's something unusual about your records." I frowned, unsure what that meant. My mind went immediately to the accident report or the insurance forms I hadn't filled out yet. He placed a sealed hospital envelope on my lap. "Your blood samples were run through a national database," he continued. The results raised a few questions. Before I could ask what kind of questions, he set down a photograph, a worn, fading picture of a little girl with light curls and a smile that didn't quite stay centered. The image looked old, older than I could place, the edges softened from being handled too many times. This child was taken from her home in Albany, New York, 27 years ago, he said. Her name was Rachel Lawson. I stared at the picture, confused. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. The younger detective stepped forward, his expression measured. "Because your hospital DNA sample matched the Lawson family file," he said. It was a perfect match. For a moment, the room felt smaller. The steady hum of the machine seemed louder, and the thin blanket felt too warm against my skin. I shook my head, trying to understand what he was telling me. "I was born in Illinois," I said, my words coming out uneven. "Gary's my father. My mother." The older detective opened the folder again, revealing documents I didn't recognize. "Your birth certificate appears to be forged," he said in a calm, matter-of-fact tone. "The Social Security number tied to your name was filed 2 years after your stated birth date, and there is no hospital record of your delivery anywhere in this state." I let the information wash over me, unsure where to begin. They didn't push me for a response. Instead, he waited, letting the silence fill the space between us. I looked again at the photo of the little girl, and then touched the side of my face without thinking. A small birthmark near her eye was mirrored on my own skin. The detectives exchanged another glance, and then the older one spoke. "We understand this is a lot to take in," he said. "We're arranging a second test to confirm the results, but we wanted to notify you as soon as we received the first report. Your biological parents have been searching for you for nearly 3 decades." He set a business card on the bedside tray and stepped back as if giving me room to breathe. "Someone from the Lawson family will arrive tomorrow," he added. "They've already been notified." I nodded slowly, though I wasn't sure what I was agreeing to. After they left, the door drifted shut behind them, and the quiet settled back around me. The photograph lay on my lap, its edges worn thin from years of hope and waiting. I looked at it until the lights in the hallway dimmed again, until the nurse brought in dinner and then took it away untouched. Each time I glanced at the girl's small smile, the same questions rose up in my chest. Questions I had never known to ask, questions I had learned to avoid. My world had revolved around simple truths I had accepted without hesitation. Now those truths felt fragile, shifting with every heartbeat. By the time the sky outside turned dark, the weight of the day pressed heavy across my shoulders. The beeping of the monitors seemed louder, the ticking clock on the wall marking each second with slow precision. I lay back against the pillows and tried to steady my breathing while rain began to tap quietly against the window. The picture of the little girl remained beside me on the blanket. I didn't know who she was yet. I didn't know who I was either. And as I closed my eyes, I could feel something just beginning to break open, something that would soon unravel every piece of the life I believed was mine. The hours after the detectives left moved slowly, as if the hospital walls had thickened overnight. I kept the photograph of the little girl close, setting it on the pillow beside me, where I could see it whenever I turned my head. The rain eased some time before dawn, leaving streaks of water on the window that caught the early light. Carla came in for the morning check and paused when she noticed the folder still resting on my lap. She didn't ask about it, but her expression softened the way it had the day before. I answered her questions, let her adjust the machines, and then watched the door close again, leaving me in a room that felt too quiet for everything happening inside it. A tray of breakfast arrived a little later, but I barely touched it. I kept glancing at the hallway, as if I expected someone to walk in with a simple explanation that would make the last 24 hours make sense. Instead, the minutes stretched, marked only by the steady rhythm of the heart monitor beside me. By mid-morning, I tried calling Gary again, my good hand trembling slightly as I pressed the button. The call dropped almost immediately, the same clipped message blinking on the screen. I held the phone for a moment longer before setting it aside. I had just leaned back into the pillows when a soft knock sounded at the door. Carla peeked in first, her expression unusually solemn. "Someone's here to see you," she said. She stepped aside, and a tall man in a charcoal suit appeared behind her. His hair was silver at the temples, and the expression on his face was a mixture of hope and exhaustion, as if he'd carried those emotions for years. He paused at the threshold, one hand resting lightly on the frame, and seemed to steady himself before walking toward my bed. "Hannah," he said, his voice tight but gentle. I didn't correct him. I didn't know what else to do. "My name is William Lawson." He hesitated, searching my face. I'm your father." The room seemed to shift at the edges. For a moment, all I could hear was the muffled hum of the ventilation system overhead. He took another slow step forward, keeping some space between us, as if giving me time to take in the sight of him. "I didn't come here as the founder of anything," he added, his voice catching. "I came because I've been waiting 27 years to see my daughter again." I looked at him, unsure what to say. He reached into his coat and placed a small silver locket on the bedside table. "You wore this the day you were taken," he said quietly. "Your mother kept an identical one. She never stopped believing we'd find you." I picked it up with careful fingers, feeling the cool metal against my skin. Inside was the same little girl from the photograph, her curls a bit messy, her smile shy. William watched me closely, but he didn't rush me. When the detectives called this morning, he said I came as fast as I could. He ran a hand over his jaw, looking briefly toward the window before turning back. "Your mother is at home waiting. She wanted to come, but we agreed one of us should meet you first in case this felt overwhelming." I nodded slightly, unsure how to respond. He didn't seem offended by my silence. Detective Mercer arrived a short while later, a folder in hand with Detective Doyle behind him. Mercer stood near the foot of the bed and opened the file. "We have the results of the second DNA test," he said in a steady tone. "It confirms what we suspected. You are the biological daughter of William and Margaret Lawson." William exhaled quietly beside me, his eyes closing for a moment. I glanced between the detectives, waiting for them to continue. Mercer exchanged a brief look with his partner. "We need to talk to you about the man who raised you," he said. "Gary Cole is not his legal name. His birth name is Gary Hales." I sat straighter, my pulse thudding in my ears. Mercer continued. 27 years ago, Mr. Hales worked as a contracted security guard on the Lawson estate in Albany. He had access to staff areas' visitor logs and family routines. Doyle opened another folder, sliding a paper across the bedside tray. It was a copy of a ransom note, the edges yellowed with age. Hales and a woman named Linda Hales, who later went by the last name Cole, sent 3 demands to the Lawson home after your disappearance, Doyle said. Your parents paid each one, nearly $2 million in all. William kept his gaze low, his hands clasped together on his knees. Mercer continued. Within weeks, both suspects disappeared. They changed their names, moved repeatedly across state lines, and eventually settled in Illinois. Your records were altered sometime after that. I stared at the cuff of my hospital gown, the seams stitched in a neat line. He always said my mother died when I was 13, I said quietly. Mercer nodded. Linda Hales did pass from a lung infection, but she was not your biological mother. He paused. We believe she may not have been the mastermind. Our initial findings point to Hales taking the lead, but she lived under that secret for the rest of her life. William lifted his head, then his eyes meeting mine with a steady calm. You didn't do anything wrong, he said, his tone even. None of this was your fault. I swallowed hard, though I wasn't sure whether the words brought comfort or more questions. Doyle closed the folder gently. We have officers searching for Hales now. Once he's located, you'll have the choice to speak with him or not. The detective stepped out a moment later, leaving William and me, seated in a silence that felt fuller than before. The locket rested on the table between us, its hinge slightly worn from use. William leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Your mother sets a place for you at the dinner table every night, he said softly. She never gave up hope. He paused as if giving me space to absorb the thought. We've missed everything. He added, his voice low. Birthdays, first days of school, every moment we should have been there for. I studied his face, noticing the faint lines near his eyes and the way his shoulders seemed both powerful and weary. He wasn't a stranger, not entirely. Something about the way he carried himself felt familiar, subtle, and unspoken. Neither of us tried to name it. Later that afternoon, Mercer returned to check in, giving us an update. We located Hales, he said. He left Illinois sometime last night, but we traced the vehicle to Milwaukee. Local deputies are holding him for questioning. We'll transport him back as soon as possible. He looked at me with a calm I had seen in him since the first day. You don't have to decide anything now. But if you want to see him, we can facilitate a supervised visit once the transfer is complete. William waited until the detectives left before turning toward me. You don't have to face him alone, he said. Whatever you choose, we'll support you. I rested my good hand on the edge of the blanket, unsure how to prepare for any of this. The machines beside me continued their steady rhythm, filling the quiet space. As evening settled in, the sky outside turned a muted blue. William stood near the foot of my bed, giving me a reassuring nod before heading toward the door. I'll be back first thing tomorrow, he said. Margaret wants to come with me. I nodded, and he paused for a moment longer before stepping into the hallway. The room felt different after he left, not lighter or heavier, just changed. I glanced at the locket once more, the tiny face inside smiling from a world I had forgotten. Outside, rain began again, tapping softly against the glass. I didn't know what the coming days would bring, but I could feel them drawing closer, each new truth pressing gently against the edges of my life, waiting for me to face it. When morning arrived again, the light filtered through the blinds with a quiet brightness that made the room feel less heavy. I had barely slept, waking to every shift of sound in the hallway, every passing cart or soft voice outside the door. The photograph of the little girl rested on the bedside table next to the locket, their presence steady, even as the rest of the world felt unsteady. I ran my thumb along the edge of the picture, noticing the slight curl at one corner, a sign that someone had held it many times before. My thoughts drifted from the detective's words to the image in front of me, and then back again, trying to make sense of what the next hours might bring. Carla entered with her usual calm energy, calling me by name as she checked the IV and wrote down the morning readings. She glanced at the locket, then at the photo, but she didn't ask anything. Her silence made it easier to focus on breathing, on keeping my hands still in my lap. After she finished, she gave me a reassuring nod and stepped out to bring in breakfast. I watched her leave, grateful for the space she quietly gave me. A few minutes later, the door opened again and William stepped inside. He carried himself with the same careful steadiness as the day before, but there was something softer in his face now, something like relief mixed with caution. "Good morning," he said, keeping his voice low as he approached the bed. "I thought I'd stop by early in case you were awake." I nodded, and he pulled a chair closer, resting his hands on the armrests as he sat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The quiet stretched gently between us, not awkward but thoughtful, as if we were both searching for the right place to begin. "Margaret will be here soon," he said finally. "She wanted to come with me, but I told her I'd check on you first." He paused, looking toward the hallway. "She's waited a long time for this." I listened, unsure how to respond, though the way his voice softened at the mention of her told me more than any explanation could. He reached for the locket and opened it gently, showing me the small photograph inside. "You wore this every day," he said. "You had a habit of holding it when you were tired. Margaret would carry you upstairs, and you'd have your hand wrapped around it." I watched the way he handled the locket, his fingers steady, as if it were something fragile. A knock sounded at the door, and William stood as Detective Mercer stepped in, followed by Doyle. Mercer gave a brief greeting before moving closer to the foot of the bed. "We located Hales," he said, keeping his tone professional. "He was found at a house in Milwaukee late last night. Local authorities brought him into custody without incident." I nodded slowly, listening to every word. "He's being transported back to Illinois now," Mercer continued. "Once he arrives, we'll begin questioning. You'll have the option to meet with him in a controlled environment if you choose." The room settled into a quiet that felt heavier than before. I looked down at my hands, trying to imagine what it would be like to see Gary Hales again after everything I had learned. William walked back to my side, resting one hand lightly on the chair behind him. "You don't have to decide today," he said in a steady voice. "Take your time. We're here with you." His words didn't push or pull, but they gave me something solid to hold on to in the swirl of information around me. A soft voice came from the doorway. "May I come in?" I turned to see a woman standing there, her hands clasped together in front of her. She had silver threaded through her hair and a gentleness in her eyes that made my chest tighten. William moved toward her, offering a reassuring smile. "This is Margaret," he said. She stepped forward slowly, as if unsure whether to rush toward me or keep a respectful distance. When she reached the side of the bed, she took a quiet breath and whispered, "Hello, Rachel." Hearing the name from her brought a stillness to the room. She didn't reach for my hand, but she stood close enough that I could feel her presence. "I've thought about this moment for so long," she said, her voice steady but full. "I didn't know what you would remember or how you would feel, but I wanted to be here." I nodded gently, unsure how to speak without my voice cracking. She looked at the locket on the table and reached out, touching it lightly. "I kept the matching one for all these years," she said. "I wore it on every birthday, every holiday, every time we followed a new lead." William placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her in a way that felt familiar even though I had only just met them. The two detectives stepped back, giving us space. Margaret looked at me again, her eyes warm but cautious. "You don't have to call me anything," she said quietly. "I just wanted you to know we're here." I swallowed, unable to form the right words, but she didn't wait for them. She sank gently into the chair on the other side of the bed and folded her hands in her lap. Mercer eventually cleared his throat, drawing our attention. "We'll keep you updated on the transport," he said. "If you decide to speak with Hales, we'll arrange the timing and location." Margaret looked toward him, then back at me, her expression steady. "You don't have to do anything that doesn't feel right," she said. "Not today, not tomorrow." After the detectives left, the room felt quieter, but not as empty as before. William asked if he could stay for a while, and Margaret settled into the chair beside him. They spoke softly, sharing small details about the drive, the weather back home, and the house they still lived in. I listened without interrupting, taking in the gentle rise and fall of their voices. It felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Later that afternoon, Carla returned to check the IV and adjust the cast. She glanced at William and Margaret with a small smile, then turned her focus back to her work. "You're doing well," she said quietly to me. "Let us know if you need anything." When she left, I leaned back into the pillows, feeling the weight in my chest settle into something steadier. As evening approached, William stood and reached for his coat. "We'll be back tomorrow," he said. "If you need us, the detectives know how to reach us." Margaret followed, stopping at the door to give me one final look, her expression soft and hopeful. "Try to rest," she said. "We'll see you soon." When the room finally grew still again, the light from the hallway dimming into a soft glow, I let my hand rest on the locket beside me. The sounds of the hospital continued their steady rhythm, but something in me felt different, like a quiet shift at the edge of a long-held truth. Somewhere beyond those walls, Gary Hales was being brought back, and soon I would have to decide whether to face him. Detective Mercer returned early the next morning, stepping into the room with a quiet nod as William and Margaret took their seats nearby. Sunlight pooled softly across the foot of my bed, catching the silver chain of the locket that now rested near my hand. Mercer waited until Carla finished checking the IV line before he spoke. "Hales arrived at the county facility an hour ago," he said. "He's being processed now. We can arrange a supervised meeting whenever you're ready." His voice carried that steady calm I had come to recognize, a tone meant to guide without pushing. William glanced at me, giving me plenty of space to answer. I took a breath, feeling every part of the room lean into the silence that followed. "I want to see him," I said, hearing my voice steady even as my stomach knotted. Margaret's hands folded together in her lap, not in worry but in something like understanding. Mercer nodded once. "We'll schedule transport and make sure you have the support you need." He closed the folder, gently offering a brief, reassuring look before stepping back. Doyle lingered just long enough to explain that the meeting would happen in a secure interview room and that I wouldn't have physical contact with Hales. When they left, the door eased shut behind them, and the room felt calmer, almost expectant. William leaned slightly toward me. "Are you sure you want to do this today?" he asked. I nodded again, pressing my good hand into the blanket. "I need to hear what he says," I replied. The words didn't carry anger. They carried a kind of clarity that had settled over me during the long hours of waiting. Margaret reached over, offering her hand without insisting I take it. I placed mine in hers for a moment, appreciating the steadiness of her touch, then let go gently. She gave a small nod as if to say she understood completely. By mid-afternoon, an officer from patient transport arrived with instructions about the transfer. They brought a wheelchair to the bedside and helped me settle into it, carefully adjusting the cast on my arm so it wouldn't pull against my shoulder. William walked beside me as we made our way down the hallway, while Margaret followed a few steps behind her purse, tucked close to her side. The elevator ride was quiet, except for the soft hum of the machinery. When the doors opened onto the ground level, Mercer and Doyle were already waiting near the exit. The ride to the county facility took place in an unmarked car with the heat running low. I sat in the back beside William while Margaret sat up front with Mercer. The road curved through familiar parts of Rockford, though just then everything outside the windows seemed slightly blurred, washed by the low winter light. No one filled the silence with small talk. The hum of the tires on the pavement was the only sound between us. When we reached the facility, Deputy Carl Henson met us at the entrance. He greeted Mercer with a brief handshake and then turned toward me with a respectful nod. "We have him in interview room 2, he said. "He's cuffed and seated. You'll be behind a safety partition." I followed as they guided me down a narrow corridor lined with muted gray walls. The air felt cooler here, carrying the faint scent of disinfectant and metal. As we approached the door, the deputy paused, giving me a moment before he opened it. Inside the room was smaller than I expected, with 2 sections divided by a clear reinforced panel. A table sat on each side with a small speaker near the center. Hales was already there, seated with his hands cuffed in front of him. His shoulders hunched forward and lines creased his forehead in a way I had never noticed growing up. He looked older than he had days ago, older than the last time I saw him standing in that dim hospital hallway. The wheelchair was positioned facing the glass, and William stood at my shoulder while Margaret remained by the door. When Hales lifted his head and saw me, something flickered across his expression, a mix of recognition and something harder to place. He leaned slightly forward. "Hannah," he said, his voice low. I felt the name land between us familiar and no longer mine in the way it once was. "I'm not here as Hannah," I said, my voice steady. "I'm here as Rachel Lawson." His mouth opened and closed once, as if he couldn't decide what to say next. He sat back slowly, his shoulders sagging. "They've told you everything," he murmured. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I studied the face I had watched across dinner tables, across years of quiet evenings, across moments when I had wondered whether he saw me at all. Why the single word sounded clear in the quiet room. He shifted his hands slightly, the cuffs clinking against the metal chain. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," he said. Back then things were falling apart. I thought." He paused, rubbing his thumb over the edge of the table. "I thought I could give you something different." His voice carried no confidence, only strain. William stepped closer to the glass, though he didn't interrupt. Hales continued in a quieter tone. "I panicked after the ransom. There were too many people looking too many questions. Once we left New York, everything became about staying hidden." He lifted his eyes toward me. "Linda." She wanted to stop, but we couldn't go back. I felt the steady rise and fall of my breath, the cast around my arm weighing heavily in my lap. "You left me at the hospital," I said. "You walked away." He looked down, his breathing shallow. "I knew the truth was coming," he said. "The test, the paperwork. It was only a matter of time." He glanced up again, his expression falling into something worn and hollow. "I thought maybe you would be safer if I stepped out before they found me." Margaret shifted behind me, her hands clasped tightly. William's jaw tightened, though he remained quiet. I leaned slightly forward in the wheelchair. "You could have told the truth," I said, keeping my tone even. "You could have let me go home." He shook his head. "There was no home anymore," he said. "Not after everything that happened. I couldn't undo it." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The room held the quiet sound of the ventilation system humming in an even pattern. Hales finally drew in a slow breath. "I know none of this helps," he said. "I know saying I'm sorry won't change anything." He hesitated. "But I am." I looked at him, taking in the face that had shaped so much of my life. I waited for anger to rise or for resentment to settle, but instead there was a kind of clarity, a recognition that the truth had already done its work. I didn't need answers to every question, and I didn't need him to rewrite the past. What I needed was to speak my own truth out loud. "I'm not asking for an apology," I said quietly. "I came here to hear your voice say what you did. And now I have." Hales nodded, his gaze dropping to the table again. Detective Mercer stepped into view on the other side of the doorway. "We need to conclude the session," he said gently. Deputy Henson unlocked the door, and the sound of the latch echoed faintly across the room. As they prepared to escort Hales out, he lifted his head one more time. "I did care," he said, "in my own way." His voice carried no strength behind it, just a thin thread of something unsteady. William moved closer to my wheelchair as Hales was led toward the door. The cuffs clinked softly with each step. When the door closed behind him, the room felt lighter, as if a long-held weight had finally shifted. On the ride back to the hospital, Margaret reached back from the passenger seat and placed her hand lightly over mine. I didn't pull away. The winter light slid across the dashboard, casting soft reflections across the interior of the car. When we reached my room again, William settled into the chair beside the bed, while Margaret smoothed the blanket over my legs. The quiet between us felt different now, not filled with unanswered questions, but with the slow, steady beginning of something new. I rested my hand on the locket near my pillow, feeling its familiar curve beneath my fingertips. Whatever happened next, I knew I was no longer walking alone, and soon the rest of the world would learn the truth that had been hidden for 27 years. The morning after my visit with Hales arrived with a crisp brightness, the kind that slipped quietly through the blinds and rested in soft squares across the white hospital sheets. I woke to the gentle beep of the monitor beside me and the steady hum of activity in the hallway. The locket lay by my hand again, an anchor in a world that kept shifting around me. Carla stepped in with her usual calm presence, checking the IV and offering a quiet, "Good morning," as if sensing the weight of the previous day. She didn't ask about the visit, and I appreciated the kindness in that silence. William and Margaret arrived not long after breakfast, walking into the room with a quiet steadiness that made the space feel warmer. Margaret sat beside me while William stood near the window, his hands in his pockets as he looked out over the parking lot. "Detective Mercer called earlier," he said, turning toward us. "The state has assigned a prosecutor. Things will move quickly now." His tone was measured, careful, as if he were choosing each word with deliberate thought. A short time later, Mercer arrived with Detective Doyle and a woman dressed in a tailored navy suit. She introduced herself as Assistant District Attorney Claire Benton, her handshake firm and her expression focused. She pulled a chair closer to the foot of the bed and opened a thin folder. "We'll be moving forward with the charges this week," she said. "Given the length of time involved and the severity of the case, the court has fast-tracked several preliminary hearings." Her voice carried a grounded confidence, steady and clear. She explained the process in simple terms: arraignment, pretrial motions, the likely media attention, and the expected timeline until the trial. William listened with his arms folded, nodding at each point, while Margaret sat with her hands clasped, her expression composed. Benton continued, "You'll have a designated seat in the courtroom separate from the general public. You won't need to testify in the early hearings, though you're welcome to be present." She met my eyes gently. "This will be a lot, but we will guide you through each step." When they left the room, settled into a quiet that felt different from before, less uncertain, more prepared. I sat back against the pillows, letting the information settle in. Margaret reached over and placed her hand lightly over mine. "We'll be with you," she said softly, "every step of the way." The next day when the hearing began, a transport team arranged for me to attend. Carla helped me into the wheelchair, adjusting the straps around my arm so the cast wouldn't shift. William walked beside me as we moved through the halls, while Margaret followed a step behind. The courthouse was only a short drive away, but the route felt longer, framed by gray winter skies and the quiet hum of traffic. Inside the car, no one spoke, though the silence felt steady rather than tense. The courthouse entrance buzzed with a low, constant murmur. As we approached, Mercer and Doyle met us by the security line and guided us through a side entrance. The narrow hallway we followed opened into a small waiting area outside the courtroom. A few reporters stood beyond the glass doors, their cameras raised, though security kept them at a distance. Mercer positioned himself near the door to block their view. Inside the courtroom, the air felt cooler. Rows of wooden benches lined the space, and the judge's bench stood at the front, clean and solemn. ADA Benton approached us and guided me toward the victims section, a row reserved specifically for families. "This will be brief," she said somberly. "Just the formal charges and scheduling." William settled in beside me, and Margaret sat on his other side, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When the deputies led Hales inside the room, quieted immediately. He walked with his shoulders slightly hunched, his wrists cuffed in front of him, the orange jumpsuit stark against the polished courtroom floor. He didn't look toward me or anywhere beyond the table where his public defender waited. For a moment, the years of my childhood seemed to surface in my mind, small scenes flickering behind my eyes. Dinners at the kitchen table, quiet evenings after Linda passed, moments when I had wondered why affection felt so distant in that house. Now those memories felt like they belonged to another life. The judge read the charges: kidnapping, extortion, fraud, and a long list of related counts from the years spent living under assumed names. Each charge echoed across the room, precise and unwavering. Hales stood still, his gaze fixed on one spot near the floor. When the judge asked for his plea, his attorney responded with a quiet, "Not guilty." Across the aisle, reporters scribbled notes while cameras outside flashed against the glass. The judge set the timeline for the next phase, then rapped the gavel once to close the session. As deputies prepared to escort Hales out, he lifted his head slightly, not enough to meet my eyes, but enough to acknowledge the space where I sat. Then he was led through a side door, and the courtroom slowly filled with movement again. Mercer approached us as we remained seated, giving the room time to clear. "You handled that well," he said gently. "We'll keep you informed about the next steps." William nodded his thanks, while Margaret offered a small smile. ADA Benton returned to confirm the dates for the next hearing, then excused herself to speak with the judge's clerk. We left the courthouse through the same side entrance, avoiding the reporters who had gathered near the main doors. The air outside felt brisk as the wind brushed against my face. William placed a steady hand at the back of the wheelchair, guiding me toward the car. Margaret walked beside me, her coat pulled close around her. The drive back to the hospital was quiet again, but the silence felt different this time. There was a sense of movement beneath it, as if the long-hidden story of my life was finally being brought into the open, one step at a time. When we arrived at my room, Carla met us with a warm smile, helping me ease back into bed and adjusting the blanket over my legs. William took his place in the chair near the window, while Margaret sat beside me, smoothing the edge of the blanket with a familiar gentleness. The late afternoon light drifted across the walls, casting muted reflections on the IV stand and the tray beside me. I rested my hand on the locket once more, feeling the curve of the metal beneath my fingertips. The truth had spread beyond the walls of the hospital and the confines of the courthouse. What had been hidden for nearly 3 decades was now out in the open, and the world had begun to take notice. The trial ahead would bring its own challenges, but there was a steadiness growing between the three of us, a quiet strength that made the road ahead feel less difficult. As the evening settled in and the hallway lights dimmed, I could sense that the next steps would test all of us in new ways. The story that had shaped my entire life was no longer mine alone to carry, and soon everything I had lost would be laid out in the light for everyone to see. The trial moved forward more quickly than I expected, each step unfolding with a clarity that made it hard to lose track of anything. I was discharged from the hospital 3 days before jury selection began, and William arranged for a driver to take us to and from the courthouse so I wouldn't have to worry about managing transportation while my arm healed. Margaret insisted on meeting me at the apartment every morning, helping me with the sling and making sure I had something warm to drink before we left. Her quiet presence steadied me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. On the first day in court, the air inside the building felt cool and still. Reporters lined the sidewalk, their voices rising as cameras clicked through security kept them at a distance. Mercer met us in the hallway and guided us through a side entrance leading us to the same waiting area I remembered from the earlier hearing. Adia Benton joined a moment later, carrying her neatly organized binders. "We're entering the opening statements today," she explained. "You don't need to say anything, just be here." When the courtroom doors opened, I followed William and Margaret to the victims section. The bench felt solid beneath me, the wood polished from years of use. Judge Keller entered with a quiet authority, and everyone stood before settling again. Then the deputies brought Hales in through the side door. This time, he didn't glance my way. He kept his eyes fixed on the table in front of him as he sat his jumpsuit stark under the courtroom lights. The prosecution presented a clear narrative: my disappearance, the ransom letters, the years that followed, and the evidence of the forged documents. Benton spoke with a measured calm, each piece of evidence layered carefully over the last. At one point, she lifted the photograph of the little girl, the same one that had rested on my hospital table, and held it up for the jury. A faint murmur passed through the room as they compared it to the adult sitting in the front row. The defense argued that the years had complicated Hales's memory and that emotional stress might have influenced his decisions. but even they didn't try to deny the facts. The evidence was too complete, the timeline too consistent. Throughout the testimony, Hales sat motionless, his hands folded, his gaze occasionally drifting toward the floor. During a recess, William guided me to a quieter hallway away from the cameras and the hum of conversation. "You're doing well," he said, offering a gentle smile. "This isn't easy." Margaret joined us, smoothing a hand across my shoulder. "We're here," she said. "Everything else can wait." On the final day of testimony, the courtroom felt heavier, as though everyone sensed the closing of a long chapter. Benton called Mercer to the stand, and he walked the jury through the investigation with his usual clarity. When he spoke about the DNA match, he glanced briefly toward me, offering a subtle reassurance before returning his focus to the jury. After cross-examination, he stepped down, and the prosecution rested. The following morning, closing statements began. Benton stood with quiet confidence. "This case is not about confusion," she said. "It is about a deliberate act that changed the course of one child's life and the lives of her family." Her words carried through the courtroom with steady weight. The defense offered a brief response, but it felt muted, almost resigned. When the judge dismissed the jury to deliberate, the room exhaled in a collective breath. We waited in the designated area, the hours stretching across the afternoon. Margaret sat beside me, her hands folded neatly in her lap. William paced slowly near the door, speaking occasionally with Doyle. Mercer moved between rooms, updating ADA Benton as new information came in. It was late in the day when a clerk finally appeared, her expression composed. "The jury has reached a verdict," she said. We stood and followed her back into the courtroom. The benches filled quickly, the air thick with anticipation. When the judge took his seat, the room fell completely silent. The foreperson stood with the verdict form in hand. "On the charge of kidnapping," she said, "we find the defendant guilty." A faint rustle moved through the gallery. "On the charge of extortion, guilty. On the charge of fraud, guilty." Each word felt measured, final, precise. Hales remained still, his expression unreadable. Judge Keller thanked the jury, then delivered the sentence with solemn clarity: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. There was no outburst, no dramatic display. Hales simply nodded once as if accepting something he had long expected. The deputies approached and secured the chains at his wrists. As they guided him toward the exit, he lifted his head slightly, though still not enough to meet my eyes. When the door closed behind him, a quiet settled over the room, different from any silence I had felt before. Ada Benton approached and offered a gentle, steady reassurance. "You handled this with strength," she said. "Take time to breathe now." Outside, reporters waited again, their cameras flashing as Mercer shielded us from the crowd. William placed a hand on my back as we made our way to the car, while Margaret walked beside me, her expression calm. The ride away from the courthouse felt softer this time, as though some piece of weight had finally lifted from the space around us. That evening, they brought me home, not to the small apartment I'd lived in before, but to the Lawson estate in Albany. The gate opened slowly as we approached, revealing the long driveway lined with old trees. The house stood at the top, warm lights glowing through the windows. When we stepped inside, Margaret guided me down a quiet hallway. "We kept this room just as it was," she said softly. The door opened to a space painted in soft yellow, with a small bed in the corner, draped in a handmade quilt. A faded teddy bear rested on the pillow. The air smelled faintly of lavender, as though someone had been here recently tending the room with quiet care. "I cleaned it every week," Margaret said, "just in case." I stepped inside slowly, taking in each small detail. William stood in the doorway, his expression gentle and hopeful. "This was the last place you saw," he said. "We wanted you to have it back." I ran my fingers lightly along the quilt, the threads worn from years of love and waiting. The room felt familiar, in a way I couldn't fully name a place held open for someone who had vanished but was never forgotten. When I turned back toward them, neither of my parents spoke. They didn't need to. Their presence filled the room quiet and steady, as though they were offering me not just a space to rest, but a place to begin again. And as the evening settled outside the windows, I sensed the final chapter of this story approaching one that would bring me from justice into something gentler, something like peace. The house felt still that first night, the kind of quiet that settles in after a long storm. William and Margaret walked me through the hallway one more time before leaving me to rest their voices low and steady as they pointed out small details they had kept unchanged. When they finally closed the door behind them, I sat on the edge of the small bed, running my hand across the quilt that had waited decades for a child who never returned. The room felt both familiar and new, like a memory I couldn't fully reach, but could feel somewhere deep inside. I lay back carefully, listening to the soft hum of the house and let myself breathe in the calm that followed the rush of the last weeks. Morning light slipped gently across the wall, warming the room in slow strokes. Margaret knocked softly before stepping inside with a tray of breakfast. She set it on the small dresser and smiled, her eyes carrying that same quiet hope I had seen from her since the day we met. "Take your time," she said. "Everything else can wait." Her voice held no expectation, only care. When she left, I sat with the warm tea in my good hand, letting the steam rise toward me. For the first time in years, there was no rush to clock in at the diner, no call to make no weight on my shoulders, asking me to push through just one more day. The stillness felt unfamiliar, but somehow comforting. William joined me later, walking slowly around the room, as if he wanted to give me room to speak if I chose to. He pointed out the small details, how the wallpaper had been touched up over the years, how they'd kept the teddy bear in the same spot, because it had felt right. "We never knew what you would remember," he said quietly, "but we wanted you to have something waiting." I nodded, appreciating the care behind each choice, even if the memories hadn't come back. We sat together for a while, the quiet between us steady and unhurried. In the days that followed, I began to settle into a rhythm. Physical therapy appointments filled some afternoons, and Margaret often came along sitting nearby with her knitting as I worked through the exercises. William drove me to meetings about the Lawson Foundation, explaining how they offered support to families searching for missing children. When he asked if I would like to join the team once I healed, his tone carried no pressure, just an open door. "Your voice could help others," he said. I agreed to think about it, grateful for the gentleness in his offer. A few weeks after the sentencing, I asked Mercer to arrange a visit to the prison. Margaret had hesitated at first, but she didn't try to stop me. "If it gives you peace," she said, "we'll support you." William waited in the lobby while a guard escorted me down the long hallway. The air felt cooler inside the steps, echoing softly off the concrete walls. When the guard opened the door to the visiting area, Hales was already seated on the other side of the glass, his hands resting quietly on the table. He looked thinner, his shoulders more stooped, but he didn't seem surprised to see me. I sat down in the chair across from him and picked up the receiver. He lifted his slowly. "You didn't have to come," he said, his voice low. I nodded, keeping my tone measured. "I know." He looked down at his hands, his fingers tracing the edge of the table. "I don't expect anything," he said. His voice trailed off and he shook his head slightly. "I'm glad you're safe." I reached into my bag and pulled out a small photograph, one William had taken a week earlier, of me standing with my parents in the garden behind the house. I placed it against the glass. "This is where I am now," I said. "I wanted you to see it." He studied the picture for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally looked up, there was no defense in his eyes, no excuses, only the weight of choices he couldn't take back. I didn't stay long. When I stood to leave, he nodded once, and I nodded back. Nothing more was needed. Outside the building, the winter air felt crisp against my face. William stepped forward, placing a hand at the small of my back. "You all right?" he asked. I took a slow breath and nodded. "I am." We walked toward the car together, the gravel crunching quietly under our feet. That evening I stood by the window in my childhood room, watching the last light fade behind the trees. The house felt warm and lived in each hallway, carrying a softness I had never known growing up. I thought of the years I spent believing I wasn't wanted, of the long nights, wondering what I had done wrong, and of the truth that had broken open inside that hospital room. None of it defined me now. What mattered was the family that had waited with open hands and a steady heart, and the life that stretched ahead of me like a quiet, open path. As I turned away from the window, I reached for the locket, resting on my nightstand, and held it gently in my palm. I wasn't the lost child anymore, or the frightened woman calling for someone who wouldn't come. I had found my way home, not to the place I had grown up, but to the people who had never stopped searching for me. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If any part of it touched something in your own life, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to follow along.